Welcome back to another insightful session here on Green Dolphin Science.
Great to be back.
Today we're diving deep into a study that looks at something we all use pretty much every day. Table salt.
Ah, yes, salt.
Specifically, we're going to unpack some really recent and I think quite fascinating research that investigated microplastic contamination.
Right. In commercially available table salt, and specifically in Nepal.
Exactly. And for you, someone who, values staying informed about the world around them, this feels particularly relevant.
It really does. I mean, salt's presence in our lives is just constant, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And this research uncovers a potentially significant, yet previously unknown way people might be exposed to microplastics in that region.
So we'll explore this study together. We want to focus on what really matters without getting bogged down in, super technical jargon.
Sounds good. We'll try and keep it clear.
So our main source here is a research article titled First Ever Study Uncovers Microplastic Contamination in Nepalese Table Salt.
First ever, that's key. Fills a real gap.
It does. And what's impressive is how thorough these researchers were. They actually collected salt samples from all 7 provincial zones of Nepal.
Right, so a really broad geographical scope.
Yeah. And then they used, proper scientific methods to figure out if microplastics were there, what kinds, and how much contamination there was.
So our mission for this deep dive is pretty straightforward then.
What are we aiming for?
We want to grasp the reality of microplastic contamination in Nepalese salt. Understand what kinds of these tiny plastic bits are showing up.
Okay. And where they might be coming from.
Exactly, the likely sources. And ultimately, what this might mean for the average person there in terms of their daily intake through salt.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Before we zoom right into Nepal, maybe it's helpful to just briefly touch on the bigger picture.
Good idea. The global plastic problem, yeah.
It's well established we have a lot of plastic out there. The numbers are just staggering.
They really are. Since the 1950s, plastic production has just exploded. I think the figure was around 367 million tons in 2020 alone.
Wow. That's huge.
It is. And what's key to understand is, why? Why so much?
Versatility, cost.
Exactly. Plastics are incredibly versatile, very cost-effective, so they've become indispensable everywhere, from packaging to making things.
But the downside?
The downside is this massive environmental pollution.
Mm-hmm.
And within that, microplastics are, an increasingly significant concern.
Right. It feels like we're constantly hearing about microplastics turning up everywhere. Air, water, soil.
They are pervasive.
So how do these tiny plastic bits actually, get into the environment in the first place?
Well, we generally talk about 2 main types, primary and secondary microplastics.
Okay, primary.
Primary ones are basically manufactured to be small. Think of things like the raw plastic pellets used to make bigger items.
Ah, the feedstock.
Right, or fibers from synthetic clothes that shed when you wash them. Even abrasion from tires creates them.
Got it. So those start small.
Yeah.
And secondary.
Secondary microplastics. They come from the breakdown of larger plastic waste.
Like plastic bags or bottles floating around.
And exactly. Or fishing nets, packaging. Over time, sunlight, waves, weathering, even microbes break these bigger pieces down into smaller and smaller bits.
Until they become microplastics.
Precisely. And yeah, unfortunately, they've now been found pretty much everywhere. From the top of Mount Everest down to the deepest sea trenches.
And, as we're discussing today, increasingly in our food.
That's the connection.
Now, here's where it gets maybe even more concerning. It's not just the plastic itself that's the issue, is it?
No, that's a really important point. These microplastics can act as carriers for other harmful things.
Like what?
Well, their surfaces can absorb various pollutants from the environment. We're talking persistent organic pollutants, PCBs, heavy metals, pesticides.
Wow.
Even things like pharmaceutical residues, like tetracycline, have been found associated with them.
So they kind of soak this stuff up.
They can, yeah. They can concentrate these pollutants, potentially making them more available to organisms that, accidentally eat the plastic.
So it's like a double whammy, the plastic itself, plus whatever nasty stuff it's picked up.
That's a good way to put it.
Interestingly, this study, it briefly mentions some potential, nature-based ways to tackle this. Fungi and algae.
Yeah, it does touch on that. It raises the question, can we find ways to actually clean this up?
Right.
And there is some encouraging, though still early research looking at certain fungi, like baker's yeast, actually, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and some aspergillus species.
Baker's yeast, really?
Yeah. And also algae like chlorella and spirulina. Some studies suggest they might be able to clump microplastics together or even help break certain types down in water.
Oh, that's hopeful at least.
It is. It offers a glimpse maybe of potential green solutions down the line, but definitely still needs a lot more research.
Okay. But turning back to the potential downsides for now, what are the actual risks these microplastics pose to ecosystems and, crucially to human health?
Well, for wildlife, especially in water, it's pretty clear there are negative effects.
Like what? Just filling up their stomachs?
That can happen, yeah. Reduced feeding, but also fertility problems, even physical damage to internal organs. And because they're so tiny, these micro and even nanoplastics can get into a huge range of organisms.
Right. What about us, the human health implications? That's obviously where it hits home for us listening.
That's the critical question, isn't it? And honestly, research is still ongoing to fully understand the risks.
But there are concerns.
There are, yes. Studies are looking into potential links with things like metabolic disorders, organ dysfunction, possible DNA damage, neurotoxicity, even reproductive issues.
Reproductive issues?
Yeah, there was actually a very recent study that found microplastics in human penile tissue, and they linked that to potential concerns about male fertility.
Wow. Okay, so how are we mostly exposed? Eating them, breathing them in?
All of the above, potentially. Ingestion is a big one, obviously, through food and water, but also inhalation from dust and air, and even some potential for skin contact. Each route carries its own set of potential risks that scientists are still working hard to figure out.
So given how widespread they are, maybe it's not totally surprising they're ending up in things like salt. How does salt actually get contaminated?
Well, think about where salt comes from. Seawater, salt lakes, underground mines, wells.
Right, it's harvested from the environment.
Exactly. So it's vulnerable to whatever contaminants are in that environment during harvesting. Then there's the processing, the drying, the packaging. Lots of steps where microplastics could potentially get introduced.
Especially if the salt works are near polluted areas, like coasts.
Precisely. Coastal salt pans could be quite susceptible if the surrounding waters are polluted with plastic.
And salt is just fundamental, isn't it, globally?
Absolutely. It's a universal food additive. And often it's used as a carrier for vital nutrients, like iodine, to prevent deficiencies.
So if the salt is contaminated,
it means a potentially very broad route of exposure for a huge number of people worldwide.
Okay, that sets the stage really well. So now let's really focus in on this Nepalese study.
Yeah.
Why Nepal? Why was this specific research needed?
Well, as we said, there's growing research on salt contamination globally, but there was basically nothing specifically for Nepal, a real data gap.
So this study was the first to systematically look.
Exactly. The first to really assess the presence, the types, the amounts of microplastics and table salt sold right across Nepal, all 7 provincial zones.
Trying to get that baseline understanding.
That's the goal.
And how do they actually do the investigation? You mentioned identifying salt companies.
Yeah, they first identified the 5 main brands of packaged salt that people commonly buy there.
Okay.
Interestingly, only 1 was actually a Nepalese company. The other 4 were Indian companies whose salt is sold widely in Nepal.
Right. And then they collected samples.
They did. 24 samples altogether from different districts, and they were careful to note things like, the packaging date, how it was being stored in the shop.
I'm trying to see if those factors mattered later on.
Exactly. Good scientific practice.
Okay, so they get the samples back to the lab. How do you actually find tiny bits of plastic in salt?
It involves a few steps. They used a chemical method, Fenton's reagent, to basically dissolve away the salt itself and any organic bits.
Leaving the plastic behind.
Hopefully, yes. Leaving the microplastics isolated. Then they filter that out.
And look under a microscope.
Pretty much. Using stereomicroscopy and digital imaging to see the particles, count them, look at their shape and color.
And they could tell what kind of plastic it was.
Yes, and this is important. They used a technique called FTIR analysis. It's a type of spectroscopy that can identify the specific polymer, the type of plastic material.
Okay, pretty thorough. So the big question, what did they find? What were the key results from this first ever study in Nepal?
Well, the headline finding was pretty stark. Ubiquitous contamination.
Meaning?
Meaning every single one of the 24 samples they tested had microplastics in it. Every single one.
Wow. Regardless of the company, Nepalese or Indian?
Didn't matter. 100% contamination across the board.
That is quite something. What about the amount? Was it just a few particles or more significant levels?
It varied quite a bit. The range was from 80 microplastics per kilogram of salt up to a high of 1040 per kilo.
1040 per kilo. That sounds like a lot.
It's certainly a high number. The average across all samples worked out to 381 particles per kilogram.
Okay, 381 on average.
Yeah, plus or minus about 219, showing that variability. A lot of the samples actually fell into the 301 to 400 range.
And given that salt intake in Nepal is relatively high.
Exactly. That average concentration translates into a potentially significant exposure route, one that just hadn't been quantified there before.
Right. And what do these microplastics actually look like? Did they find different colors and shapes?
They did, yeah. Quite a variety. 8 different colors were observed.
8 colors.
Yep. Blue is the most common, actually found in every single sample.
Blue in all of them. Huh.
Followed by black, which was in about 79% of samples, and then brown in 75%. That color diversity points towards different sources of contamination, probably.
Makes sense. And shapes. Were they mostly fibers or fragments?
Predominantly fibers. Fibers made up 56%, so more than half.
Okay.
Then they found films, like little bits of wrap or bags maybe, at 17%. Fragments, just irregular bits, were 16%. And pellets, those primary plastic beads, were about 11%.
And where might those fibers be coming from? Clothes?
That's a likely source, yeah. Textiles shedding fibers during production or washing, but maybe also from processing equipment or even the packaging materials themselves. The fragments likely come from bigger bits of plastic breaking down.
Okay. And the actual plastic types, did they find lots of different polymers?
Surprisingly, no. The FTIR analysis only identified 2 types.
Only 2. Which ones?
Polyethylene, which accounted for 80% of the microplastics they identified.
Okay, PE.
And
Very common.
extremely common. And the other 20% was polypropylene, PP.
Also very common. Packaging, containers.
Exactly. So the types of plastic found are consistent with the most widely produced plastics that are often found polluting, especially the marine environment where some salt originates.
Now, you mentioned they recorded things like storage and packaging dates. Did those factors actually make a difference to the amount of microplastics found?
That's a really interesting part of the study. They looked for correlations.
Right.
And they found no statistically significant link between the microplastic levels and things like whether the salt was stored inside or outside the shop, how old the package was, or even how thick the plastic packaging was.
Really? So the packaging itself wasn't the main source?
It doesn't seem like it, based on this data. It strongly suggests the contamination is happening before packaging, likely during the salt harvesting, production, or processing stages.
That's a key insight then. The problem might lie further up the chain.
It certainly points in that direction. It suggests focusing on the raw materials and the purification methods used during production.
So, based on finding these levels, around 381 particles per kilo on average, they could estimate how much plastic someone in Nepal might be eating from salt.
Yes, they did that calculation. Because, as we mentioned, average salt consumption in Nepal is quite high, about 13.3 grams per person per day.
Higher than the global average.
It is, yeah. So combining that consumption rate with the average microplastic levels they found
Gives you an estimate of intake.
Right. They estimated that Nepalese individuals might be ingesting an average of around 1,853 microplastics each year just from salt.
1853 a year. That works out to, what, about 5 per day?
Roughly, yeah. Around 5 microplastics per day solely from their salt intake.
And how does that number, that level of contamination, compare to studies done in other countries? Is Nepal high or low?
They did make some comparisons. Based on the studies they looked at, the estimated intake level in Nepal seems to be kind of moderate.
Moderate. Okay.
Yeah, compared to some other countries where salt contamination has been studied. But it's important to add a caveat there.
Yes.
Different studies often use slightly different methods for extracting and counting the microplastics, so direct comparisons between countries need to be, interpreted with a bit of caution.
Fair enough. Did they see differences between the salt companies they tested?
They did, yeah. There were significant differences in the average microplastic levels across the 5 companies. One of the Indian companies actually showed particularly high levels compared to the others.
Interesting. But overall, Nepalese packaged versus Indian packaged.
Overall, when they averaged it out, there wasn't a significant statistical difference between the salt packaged in Nepal versus the salt packaged in India but sold in Nepal.
Oh, okay. So pulling all of this together, what are the main implications here? What should we be taking away from this study?
Well, I think it really highlights a clear need for improvements, both in the quality of the raw materials used for salt production, and perhaps more importantly in the purification processes.
The current methods aren't getting these plastics out effectively enough.
It seems not. The study also really underscores the importance of setting up regular monitoring. We need to keep track of these levels in salt, maybe identify hot spots or sources of higher contamination.
And they specifically pointed out they only looked at packaged salts, right?
That's a critical point, yes. They recommend future research absolutely needs to look at the loose, unpackaged salt.
Because that's commonly used too.
Very commonly used in Nepal, apparently. And you'd imagine it might be even more exposed to environmental dust and contaminants after production.
Right. Makes sense.
So ultimately, these findings are really valuable. They give information to consumers, hopefully spur the salt industry to look at its processes, and give policymakers data to, potentially develop strategies to reduce microplastics in the food supply.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? Well, as this deep dive shows, microplastic contamination in salt isn't just some abstract environmental issue.
No, it's a tangible reality, certainly in Nepal, based on this study. And we know from global research it's a concern elsewhere, too.
And while the long-term health effects are still being figured out,
Right. The science is still evolving there.
the sheer presence of these tiny plastics and their known ability to potentially carry other pollutants is definitely something worth thinking about.
Absolutely. And here's where it gets, I think, particularly interesting, that finding about the manufacturing process likely being more significant than packaging or storage.
Yeah, that stood out.
It suggests the root of the problem might lie quite early in the supply chain, which highlights just how complex this issue is.
It's not just about choosing better packaging, maybe.
It seems not entirely, no. It points towards needing interventions, possibly fundamental changes, in how salt is actually produced and purified. This study really serves as a stark reminder, doesn't it?
That contamination can enter our diet through routes we might not expect.
Even through something as seemingly basic and pure as salt?
Which really raises that bigger question. If even table salt can be contaminated like this, what other everyday things, aspects of our lives, might be contributing to our microplastic exposure without us even realizing it?
It's a sobering thought.
And it leads to the next question. What can actually be done? What steps can individuals take? Sure. But maybe more importantly, what can industries and governments do to really tackle this growing environmental and potential health concern?
Yeah, those are the big questions moving forward. For those of you listening who want to explore this more,
Where could they look?
well, you could delve into research on microplastic contamination in other foods, perhaps ones commonly eaten in Nepal or your own region, or look into initiatives that are actively working on reducing plastic waste overall or pushing for better manufacturing practices in the food industry.
Lots to think about there. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into microplastic contamination in Nepalese salt.
It's been an important topic to cover.
We really hope this exploration has given you some valuable insights and maybe even sparked your own curiosity to learn more about this critical issue.